Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, our guest is Wendy Cutler, Vice President of Asia Society Policy Institute. Wendy's best known as a trade negotiator in Washington, D.C. over her nearly 3 decades of career at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. She has worked on bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade negotiations, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, US-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. So today we'd like to ask her where the global trade is headed. Welcome, Wendy.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Right. So Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, met with the U.S. House Speaker McCarthy last week in California. Tsai asked the U.S. support to enhance the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship. Taiwan is hoping to pursue a more comprehensive relationship with the U.S., not just defense and military. When you were in the U.S. government as a senior trade official, what was your experience working on Taiwan and its trade-related issues?
Well, thank you. During the time I was at USTR and I was responsible for Taiwan during U.S.-Taiwan trade relations on a number of occasions, we had a lot of bilateral frictions, frankly, with Taiwan, whether it be in agriculture, intellectual property protection, and with respect to other manufacturing sectors, and the whole overall issue of transparency. So I found it was quite a slog with Taiwan, and that these bilateral irritants, I think, prevented us from doing something more ambitious.
And what was the main reason that Taiwan seemed resistant to make those changes?
Like other economies, Taiwan was developing into an advanced country. Clearly, it had some domestic constituencies that were benefiting from trade protection. And until Taiwan really saw it was in its own interest, for example, to strengthen its intellectual property laws, no pressure from the United States was going to make that happen. And that's not unique to Taiwan. We've seen that particularly with other Asian countries, whether it be Korea, Japan, or others as well.
And so you were just in Taiwan a few weeks ago. Has that changed much? What was your sort of thinking after that trip?
Well, our economic relationship has certainly developed over since I left USTR, and developed for the better. We have a number of dialogues with the Commerce Department and Taiwan officials, as well as with the State Department. But I think most importantly, this 21st Century Trade Initiative was launched between the U.S. and Taiwan. And I think this is an extremely important development because it looks at setting rules and developing cooperation mechanisms on a whole range of issues, including traditional trade issues, but also these emerging issues that are becoming more and more front and center in all of our bilateral economic relations.
Well, since you already mentioned the bilateral, economic trade initiative, which is, U.S.-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade that Taipei and Washington, D.C. launched last summer. Let's talk a little bit about that. It is reported just a few weeks ago that both sides are moving toward a formal trade and investment agreement. Do you see a bilateral trade agreement coming soon?
Well, again, this 21st Century Initiative, it is a trade agreement. It's not a free trade agreement because it's not comprehensive and it doesn't include market access. So it's focused on selected areas of mutual concern and interest. These include many of the topics that are under negotiation between the United States and other Asian countries in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But it also adds other issues to the table with Taiwan. And I think there is a lot of optimism that early harvest from this agreement can be shortly announced, as well as the two sides can successfully conclude this negotiation in the coming months. Progress is really, my understanding is that there's really good progress being made.
So if a trade agreement is possible, what about a free trade agreement?
Well, that gets trickier for a number of reasons. First of all, the Biden administration has made it clear that at least to date, it's not interested in pursuing traditional free trade agreements. So that really has nothing to do with Taiwan specifically.
And why is that? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think from the Biden administration's perspective, these trade agreements that the U.S. has concluded over the years has not benefited the working and middle class of America. I think there's a view that these agreements have really tilted the benefits towards business at the expense of our workers and middle class. And thus, they've been very reluctant to get on that bandwagon again, trying to pursue what they call a worker-centered trade policy.
And do you personally agree with that assessment?
So my view is more can be done to help those that are either left behind or negatively impacted by trade. But in my view, trade agreements are not the right vehicle, okay? They can exacerbate some of these problems, and therefore provisions can be put in to help at the margins. But frankly, from my perspective, this really needs to be accomplished through domestic measures. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's so much burden put on trade agreements to solve all the world's problems. And while they're useful, they're not the be-all, end-all. There are other, policy measures that need to go hand in hand with trade agreements.
Yeah, and so we saw that becoming an issue in 2016's presidential election. So we can talk about the multilateral trade agreement now. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that you actually were involved in the Obama administration, but it was scratched in the Trump administration. And even during the presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton at that time also did not support the TPP. So now it's evolved into another version, which is called CPTPP. And then the Biden administration also promoted the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. So what are they and how are they different? Help our audience understand.
Right. So right now you have the CPTPP, which is an agreement among 11 members. The United Kingdom has just successfully completed its accession negotiations, so it should become the 12th member as early as this summer. The CPTPP is what we call a traditional comprehensive trade agreement. And IPEF is more of an economic agreement with a trade component. And probably the most important differences are that, number one, CPTPP includes enforceable binding commitments, which means that it has its own dispute settlement mechanism, which countries can use to solve disputes. Second, the CPTPP provides market access, including tariff cuts. And that is not on the table for IPEF. IPEF is more about cooperation mechanisms and rules, but the United States has made it clear that it is not interested in a tariff cutting exercise as part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But there are similarities between the CPTPP and IPEF. And particularly when you look at the trade pillar, one of the four pillars of IPEF, it deals with issues like trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, agriculture, and these are issues that are subject to CPTPP rules as well. So some overlap, some important differences.
Yeah, so it sounds like IPEF is more aspirational, and CPTPP is indeed much more enforceable. And Taiwan was excluded from IPEF. However, the Biden administration did pledge to pursue a bilateral agreement, and hence we have previously talked about this, US-Taiwan initiative. I do want to talk about CPTPP because both China and Taiwan have applied to become members. And in your most recent op-ed, literally yesterday, right, in Nikkei Asia, you talk about how the UK was admitted to the CPTPP, and the next round would be negotiation with China, and maybe Taiwan would come immediately after. What do you think is going to happen since both sides have applied to join CPTPP?
Well, first, let me just make it clear that any decisions on accession need to be reached by all 11 members. So there needs to be a consensus. Second, accession negotiations, even the start of accession negotiations has to be agreed on by all members. So even though China and Taiwan applied to join, and this is over a year ago, no progress was made on those applications as long as the CPTPP members were busy working with the United Kingdom. And that makes total sense. The UK was the initial accession partner, and the CPTPP members realized that they needed to be careful in dealing with UK accession because they were establishing precedents for other candidates. There is no agreement in CPTPP, for example, that you have to deal with candidates in the sequence of their application bids. In fact, some CPTPP partners have, at least privately, expressed their view that the CPTPP members should look at accession applications based on the readiness of the country, how open they are, how ready they are to accept CPTPP rules. Others say, no, it should be sequenced and China is next. And so there is a division of views between the CPTPP members, and they're going to have to sort this out. When a similar proposition was presented to the global trade community, when China and Taiwan both applied to join the World Trade Organization over 20 years ago, there was an agreement that both accessions would be worked on simultaneously, but China would accede before Taiwan.
Just one day.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think this is a precedent that's going to hold for CPTPP. I think the world has changed, and it's very difficult for me to see how China would accept starting the accession process for Taiwan. And then the question is, what happens if they don't? I suspect for the immediate term, there will be kind of no progress made on both applications. There'll be a bit of a stalemate as CPTPP countries try to figure out a way forward. And it's a very difficult proposition that they've been handed.
So it sounds like it's unlikely that China and Taiwan would follow the precedent set by the WTO accession precedent. And also at that time, if we remember, the US was being very helpful to both sides as well. And the United States this time is not a party to CPTPP. So it's not like Taiwan can actually ask the US support or help. Taiwan did ask the UK's help when the UK trade minister visited Taiwan, and it sounded like the UK did pledge to support Taiwan. But, as Wendy just analyzed for us, it sounds like it's way more complicated this time around. Well, with geopolitical tensions riding so high, trade issue obviously has also become, I would say, has been weaponized in some way by the governments. And Taiwan's TSMC founder, Morris Chang, famously said, globalization is dead, to characterize the current semiconductor industry. And you also had the experience negotiating for semiconductor sector. And your thoughts about just global trade in general, what's happening in trade in general?
Yeah, it's a tough period, no doubt about it. The WTO just came out earlier this week and lowered its forecast for the growth in trade for this year, given all the geopolitical tensions and the uncertainties. My view is globalization as we know it is dead. And as we know it meant that for years and years, companies were driven by the principles of cost and efficiency and were willing to seek their supplies or rely on markets to the extent they made commercial sense. And I think now companies all over the world are being presented with geopolitical challenges. And so cost and efficiency just don't, as the driving factors, don't make a lot of sense in many sectors, particularly those that are linked to national security, those that involve advanced technologies, and those that are subject to regulations by governments all over the world. And that's what we're seeing in the semiconductor industry, a real desire to kind of look at these supply chains and to change them, to shorten them, and to encourage them between like-minded economies. And so I think we're going to be seeing more fragmentation, more friendshoring, more onshoring. But the days where like everyone just looked for the best deal they could on whatever part they needed for their final product, it's just not a sustainable strategy now. There are just too many risks.
But there's also a question, so especially between US and China, right? There's been a lot of dispute, as well as just, US and China, both sides slapping on tariffs, etc. But US-China trade volume also reached historic high. So the question is, do those government disputes or regulations actually have a direct impact on the actual trade, or this is more or less exaggerated by stories portrayed in the media?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, Wenji. In 2022, the US and China, at least in dollar terms, had a record two-way trade at about $700 billion. So we are shipping a lot of products back and forth. However, when you look at the composition of that trade, in certain product areas like semiconductors, trade is declining. If you look at the areas where a lot of regulations have been placed, including different advanced technologies, trade there is declining. So when you look at globalization and this whole issue of decoupling, or now the EU is calling de-risking, I think what folks are saying, that we're not saying we're going to totally decouple, and Secretary Raimondo made that very clear. We want to trade and we want to have a commercial relationship with China. However, there are certain sectors that are off limits. And so I think you'll see a push for what people call this kind of selective decoupling or selective de-risking. But the challenge for business is it's not like you can write two clear lists, like you can trade this stuff and you can't trade this stuff, because what's happened in the world that many products have both commercial and military application these days. And so it's not easy just to say this product is military application, we're going to put regulations on it. We don't have, we have national security concerns. These products, they're okay. As all these products, as the line between national security, economic security become blurred and commercial application, it's the world of regulators is becoming more and more complex. And I think this is affecting businesses who are trying to navigate their investment and trade and business plans, because there's so much uncertainty in the world.
So how should the business sector respond? If you were to advise them, what would you say to them?
I would say that you need to develop a lot of contingencies. You need to be prepared for the unexpected. You need to be prepared for being pulled in different direction by different governments. You need to be prepared for supply chain disruptions. You need to know your supply chain, not just your primary suppliers. You need to know your secondary and your third tier suppliers. And you need to basically reevaluate your business on a weekly basis to make sure, or at least to mitigate risk. I don't think in this age anyone can eliminate those risks, But there are ways to mitigate risks, and some of that may not be extremely cost effective, but it is, in my view, kind of the way companies need to go now.
Well, I think you're in high demand right now. That's very clear. So thank you so much for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room today, Wendy. We hope to talk to you again very soon. Take care.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.